Hopefully that's better. Marvelous. So what I'm going to attempt this morning is to connect some dots that I have observed over the years that I've been involved in ministry and teaching and in theological reflection. Some of them will be theological in nature, some of them will be more historical, and some simply, as you might come to expect, my own opinion. And hopefully it will become your opinion as well. One of the things I learned in my educational trajectory is that when I was an undergrad, the attitude of the prof was, when I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. When I reached graduate education, the prof's remarks were more likely to be, when I want your opinion, it should resemble my own. And then, of course, in the postgraduate work, when I want your opinion, you should be prepared to argue why it's different than mine. And so I hope that will set a bit of a tone. Trevor, where are you? Trevor Brown. Right here, Trevor Brown. So for those of you for whom something I say offends you, I apologize. For those of you for whom something that I say does not offend you, I apologize. If you're in the former camp, Trevor is leading the tomato squadron, so that you might find a bag of tomatoes with Trevor, my very good friend, and you'd be free to throw them, but please do it outside the church, as with confetti and rice, so that we don't have to tidy it up. Let me introduce myself for those of you who weren't here last evening. My name is Terry LeBlanc. I am Mi'kmaq with Acadian French blood coursing through my veins. And I reside together with my wife, Bev, in Prince Edward Island on the east end of the island, which is one of the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki, as we call the traditional lands of Mi'kmaq people. It's a land where our people have dwelt for, well, if you were to look at the marquee on the first ever fair trade coffee roastery in just outside Wolfville, Nova Scotia, on your way to Acadia University, you would have seen last year for a couple of days the words Canada 150 emblazoned on the marquee. And then a couple of days later, for good effect, you would have seen underneath it Mi'kma'ki 13,000. We've been there for a while, and my ancestors in that land continue as part of the land to instruct our folks there. Our ancestor, Kichisagama member 2, was baptized into the French Jesuit Catholic version of Christian faith on June 24th, 1610. And so we look back to those days as days that initiated or inaugurated Christian faith and life as a journey for many Mi'kmaq people. Not all, but many. I'm also the father of 3 wonderful children, twin daughters. Together with my wife, Bev, we've raised, they're mirror twins, if you're familiar with that, and a son. Our daughters work in education, one doing her PhD at the University of Alberta in Indigenous Studies, where she's investigating the impact of the role of patron Saint Anne, the patron saint of Mi'kmaq people, on the lives of Mi'kmaq women down through the centuries. So really excited to see what emerges from her work. The other daughter, Jennifer, lives and works in Fredericton, New Brunswick, where she is the coordinator facilitator for the Mi'kmaq-Wolastoqey Language Revitalization Program at the University of New Brunswick, and she also does course development and teaching. Our son Matt leads an Indigenous youth and young adult framed community development ministry in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, as well as in Canada and the US, working with Indigenous youth and young adults. I bring you greetings on all of their behalf, as well as greetings from the collected peoples of the Mi'kmaq Nation who would want to send you their greetings. Not all would, but I bring you greetings on behalf of those who certainly would. I also want to acknowledge that here today, we're on this wonderful land, the territory that has been inhabited over thousands of years by many people, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas, The Iroquoian community who, together with the Ojibways, which is inclusive of the Mississaugas, shared this land around the Great Lakes on the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And this morning in this place, whether you're aware of it or not, we together are the guests of those who have gone before us in this land and those who continue to be its stewards, as I believe by the gift of the one who made all. And we're treaty people here on this land, whether you're aware of it or not. We are here by reason of treaties having been forged and lived by, at least for some space of time, in a good way. They give us our ability to be here. These are things that were forged in a good way, and I believe God, the Creator, the author of all, superintended over that in some way, shape, or form so that we might be here today. So we're here by their good graces. My wife and children and I, over the years, attempted to live in some traditional ways on the land to the extent that it was possible in contemporary society. When my wife and I were married 47 years ago, this past month, I was a trapper, a fur trapper, for my living in the wintertime for a few years, continued for a few years into our marriage. And we wanted our children to have this experience of the land, to know and understand the feel of the land under their feet, the topography, the comings and goings of its creatures. We wanted them to understand how interdependent and interconnected and interrelated with the land they were. So as much as we could, we took them out through their years of growing up onto the land each and every summer, and when we could in the winter, to live on the land, to live from the resources that it provided us willingly. And one of the ways that we did that was to use horses and pack horses to go out into the bush, as we would have called it, into the woods, into the land where the closest neighbor was many, 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 many miles from where you were. Now, my wife is a horse trainer. Throughout her life, she raised and trained horses for these kinds of endeavors, and she would then pass them along to people either by a barter system. In many cases, we didn't make much money off it, or a sale to someone who she felt would care for the animal well. And again, we didn't make much money off of it, but she loved doing it, and she did it so terribly well. She also trained our hunting dogs, and she was wonderful with training animals. The only animal she has had difficulty with has been me. And she's still working on it. She asserts with some confidence she'll get it right yet. Well, we were out on the land one day with some non-Indigenous friends who had come to observe our lifestyle and wanted this experience of being on the land with us on horseback. And they were newly come to horses and to travel outside of the show ring. So while they did well in the show ring with their horses, they hadn't really traveled on the land with them. But we thought it would be fun to help to introduce them to being on the land and becoming somewhat more dependent on the land. And so they joined us about a week into our normal summer venture, and we set out the morning after their arrival to take them to a place. I think my earring is ticking on the microphone. Let me just take that off for a moment. There we go. Peter, you'll remind me that it's there, and please don't take it on me. I don't think it'll look good on you. So we set out on the land in the early morning, and it had been a summer of a great deal of rain, and so the ground was quite soggy in many places. But we were very familiar with the terrain and left with confidence on a trail that we had taken many times over the years. Well, we came to a particular point in the trail, and the trail forked, and it was kind of like Robert Frost. There's these two trails diverged in the woods, and that was sort of the scenario. And we took one, and that made all the difference. And we took this trail and headed off, and it wasn't long, and our horses were up to their fetlocks, the ankle joint, if you will, in mud. And then a little while later, they were sort of mid-cannon bone, which is sort of your shin, in mud. And then a little while later, up to their knees. And we were still going ahead with confidence. The horses were not concerned, and they knew us, and we knew them, and so we weren't concerned. But as we looked behind us, the folks behind us, this couple who had taken their first journey into the woods, were turning whiter than they were. And we were a bit anxious for them. So we stopped and said, are you okay? And they expressed their anxiety about, somehow falling into a spruce bog and not being able to get out. And so, discretion being the better part of valor here, we decided we would circle round through the woods on firmer ground and come back to that other trail, the one that we had chosen not to take. And so we did. We circled back and found our way to a wonderful dry trail. And we did so because over the course of time we had come to know the land. And it led to a more stable relationship with our friends. They were a little more willing to take us at our word in the future. Now, a second story I want to tell you that will put that one in perspective is a story when I was a young child. It's the only time that I can recall where my grandfather, father, and I spent an entire day together on the land, and we did so on a bit of a fishing trip. We got on the ferry that took us across from the Lower Gaspé Peninsula where the reserve is, and got off at Campbellton, New Brunswick, got in an old beater of a car that my grandfather owned, and headed off down the road to a fishing spot known only to him. And that fishing spot was some miles journey by car. We parked the car at the side of the road, unloaded our gear and a bit of a lunch, and set out into the woods. My grandfather in the lead, me in the middle, and my father taking up the rear. We hadn't gone very far, and I took note as a young boy about so high that the woods were closing in around me, and it was becoming quite dark. The woods were quite dense in this area, and so I tugged on my grandfather's arm and I expressed my concern for where we were and where we were going, and would we be able to find our way back. And my grandfather looked over his shoulder and gave me words of reassurance, and then set out again. My grandfather in the lead, me in the middle, and my father behind. I'm sure in his mind he hadn't gone 2 paces, and I tugged his arm again. Because in my view and my experience, in my fright, the woods had closed in even more, and it was even darker, and the trail less perceptible than it had been. And so again I tugged on his arm, and again he looked over his shoulder and reassured me. Well, the third time, and I'm sure he hadn't taken 2 steps in his mind, the third time I tugged on his arm and expressed my deep anxiety about getting lost, not being able to find our way back, he put his gear down, turned around, knelt down, and he told me this very simple teaching, one that has guided my life and our families over the years, whether we're in the woods or whether it's simply what we do on a day-to-day basis. And he simply said this: when you're setting out on a trail, heading somewhere that you've never been before, going whatever direction, spend twice as much of your time looking over your shoulder at where you've come from as you do where you're going. In other words, fix the landmarks in your mind the way that they're going to look when you turn around to head back, because the tree fall that was fallen to the left will now be on the right and away from you. The stump that you tripped over will now be something perhaps you stepped down off. The beaver lodge and dam that was on the right might be on the left, and it may appear suddenly from the woods because the clearing was on the side that you journeyed from, not the side you're journeying back from. In other words, look at where you've been twice as much as you look at where you're going. Fix the landmarks clearly in your mind so that when you turn to take the trail home, you'll recognize it and you won't get lost. Now, I've used that whether it's in the woods or driving in Toronto, although I must say it's much easier in the bush than on the 401 parking lot. I've used it as a means of navigating life, again, whether it's an actual trail or whether it's a reflection on where we've been. And it's in part that I want to talk to you about when I talk about circular theology in a linear world for this morning. The Western penchant to set most things of the present into a hoped for, a dreamed about, an anticipated future tends to eclipse the present, and it definitely, almost exclusively ignores the past. There is this sense in which we got here almost by an ex nihilo time warp. Somehow we've arrived in this moment, and how we got here is, in a sense, irrelevant. Because what's relevant is the future. Now, to put this in some perspective, Western societies, Western-influenced societies today in particular, focus on a timeline that has the future out in front of them. We're walking into the future. We're driving toward the future. We're planning for the future. We're anticipating the future. We're building for the future. And the past is behind, somewhere back here. And the moment you move through the present, the past is irrelevant. It has little to say to you other than perhaps the 24-hour day that you might want to recall the next morning. Where was I and what did I do? Particularly if you've been imbibing a little overmuch. Whereas for indigenous folks, traditionally, at any rate, quite the opposite is true. The future lies here, behind us. The past is here in front of us. We can describe how we got to this present moment with a great deal of detail if our memories carry it well. I can tell you that my 18th great-grandparents are buried in a little cemetery just outside of Grand Pré, Nova Scotia. Now, the cemetery there is not very discernible today, but in the past, you could tell where the graves were. I can tell you the 18 generations, because that's what gave rise to who I am. I stand here today not because of events of the future yet unfolded, but because everything in the past that led me to this very moment. And so do you. None of you is here because of this conference advertised 3 weeks ago. You're here because of something that you connected with in your past, in your history, that led you to this moment, directed you to be here and experience a relationship, a conversation in your past. Nothing in the future brought you to the moment because it didn't exist until you entered it. And now it's the past. And this is something indigenous folks have lived with throughout our history. The past is unknown and unknowable. Oh, no, quite the opposite. The future is unknown and unknowable. The past is quite known and quite knowable. Again, to the extent that our memories will carry it well. And so, as we look at Western society, including our churches and our theological traditions, they have been driven by an eschatological vision, a dream about the future, an expectation and hope for the future, and not inappropriately, necessarily, in some respects. But that drive has tended to eclipse their life in the present moment oftentimes, and certainly cause the past to disappear into oblivion. So that everything then is about the future. All consequence of current behavior is deferred to the future. We were just talking about that. John Vissers and I were just talking about this idea of deferred maintenance on these wonderful facilities that we sometimes have. We'll just defer the consequence of decay to somewhere in the future. And of course it catches up with us. The deferred maintenance of a building and the deferred maintenance of a society in light of a driven for future tends to catch up with us. And since it's the present challenges that we're trying to address, for me, particularly in the indigenous world, in the post-TRC era that we're in, it makes great sense to be clear, not simply in legal language, we did this and our contract reads thus, but in actual embrace of how we arrived at this point in our common journey. And I'm not just talking about the indigenous, non-indigenous relationships here, I'm talking about us as a human community. How did we get here? How did we get to this point where we're continuing to talk about conflict, where yesterday we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the armistice, the war to end all wars, and yet we are still in this place of constant battle over land and resource, over religious traditions, over position and power. The idol that Jesus spoke most about was mammon. And mammon is not simply wealth, it's about power, wealth, and control. This is the common human struggle, is to set down power, to put aside the need to control, and to refrain from the pursuit of wealth for its own sake. And yet we're still there. So this is not circular theology in a linear world just about indigenous folk. It's about us as a human community. Albert Einstein is often misattributed as to have said the definition of insanity is doing something over and over again and expecting a different result. Apparently he did not say that. But what he apparently did say, quoted in many versions and with some different phraseologies and paraphrases, is that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And irrespective of whether we're looking at the traditions of the church, as we're here to talk about over these next days, or we're looking at the impact of the traditions of the church on the society around us, and make no mistake, though the Enlightenment and the immediate post-Enlightenment move society increasingly away from dependence on the church to determine philosophical and practical implications of life in the world, it is the church and its theology that has had the most significant influence in society that has led us to this present moment. And we need to own that. We need to own the fight over turf, the comity agreements that divided people groups so that mission could be undertaken, the lands that were taken from peoples around the globe so that Christian dominion could be exercised, the ideas that pursued. Let me step back from one. I love Paul in Acts 17 where he talks about the common humanity from which we emerge. From one human being he made every nation of human beings. He established their places, the times of their dwelling, their purposes. A common one that we might seek after, reach out for, and perhaps take hold of God. I love that idea, this common humanity idea that we sometimes have ignored for the sake of the pursuit of these other things that are very future-focused, that are very driven towards some achievement down the road that will either accommodate the errors of the past or correct them. And if we're careful to look, we find that has not been the case, for the most part, with some exceptions. And I'm not a Luddite, I'm not anti-technology or development or anything of that nature. I'm simply saying we need to be more careful about our examination of how we got to this present moment than we are about where we're going, because we don't know how we got here. We're not actually very convinced about that. Or if we were, we might change our behavior. So there are two passages in the biblical narrative very much open to interpretation, and so I'm going to offer mine, that might help frame our thinking about what God did in creation and what God might be doing in recreation that I think has some impact, some influence on this, and that brings the idea of this a circular theology to what has been a very linear, future-focused world. The first is found at the beginning of the biblical narrative, and you're familiar with it. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east in Eden, and there he put the human being he had formed. And the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now the story of Genesis makes clear that something about which we do not hear over much, that there were two trees in Eden. You know, when I do a creation theology course for my students, I inevitably ask them, or when I'm talking about it, now I've sort of predisposed you to thinking about it a different way already, but I ask people to put their hand up, how many of you have heard a sermon where the pericope of the text and the focus of the message was on the tree of life. And for the most part, and probably the 90+% range, that's not an accurate empirical statistical analysis, by the way. Most would say no, they hadn't. How many of you heard a sermon on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Absolutely. It's at the core of our theology, the Augustinian apple core. The tree of life is something about which we hear almost nothing. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or at least the consumption of its fruit, is central, however, to our faith. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the historic backdrop for the loss of covenantal interdependent relationships. And so last night, if you were here, you would have heard me reference the fact that in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, these 3 spheres of relationship with some subtexts to them were what was damaged. I see it more as clearly more as a covenantal breach than a breach of law, since no law was given at the time, other than an instruction about how one maintains covenant with the creation that you're a part of, to our first parents. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is this backdrop for these relational spheres that are damaged. The sphere of relationship with our Creator and other spiritual powers. And last night I made note of the fact that as an indigenous person who does theology, when I talk about other spiritual powers, inevitably, particularly in the more conservative Christian traditions, people get the heebie-jeebies. They begin to make the sign of the cross and pray. Because those indigenous folks, they worship all those spirits. This is not the point. The point is that there are spiritual forces at play. Paul would talk about spiritual forces of wickedness in high places. Perhaps, again, the kind of Kenley Enron scenario where there is a spirituality of greed that causes a large corporation like Enron to cycle down the tubes and take much of the wealth of people and the hope of people with it. But there is this sense in which there are spiritual powers at play. The biblical text talks about some of these spiritual beings. Indigenous folks understand that there are spiritual beings and that the creation is ontologically a place of spirituality. We don't make the immediate separation of material and spiritual, where the material and physical world is unspiritual and only human beings are spiritual. We don't do that. We talk about there's this presence of the spirituality of all of creation, and it is there by reason of it having been created by a creator. And so we have this tautological statement, I am created, therefore there's a creator. There's a creator, therefore I am creation. And we understand that there's a spirituality that is resident within the entirety of it, as opposed to simply in human beings. And so we must be in right relationship, not only with the one who made, but with the things made, including other spiritual powers. It's not just God. There are other spiritual beings at play in creation, and Western society has so frequently ignored those. The scientific drive has ignored those. And I like to say to people, one of my undergrad degrees was in science, and I pursued a graduate program in science following that. So it's not that I'm anti-science, I just understand that there's a tendency to try and reduce things by empirical verification to some grasp or ability to comprehend that perhaps lies beyond us at any rate. The second area or sphere of relationship, of course, is the setting in which dysfunctional relationships between human beings becomes commonplace. And we're not just talking about male and female here, though that's clearly the focus initially. But we're talking about the fact that we struggle still today to live in right relationship with one another in the human community. It is such a difficult thing, it would appear. We jockey for position, we struggle for power and control. We wrestle with one another to have place and honor. It's this struggle to live well with one another in the human community. And this was a fractured reality in the Genesis 3 narrative. Something we often fail to take into account, particularly in the Western society, is this third sphere of relationship that is severed, that is damaged, and that is the relationship and the relatedness between human beings and the rest of creation, of which we are a part. You know, it's intriguing to me when I teach and talk about creation to my students, their immediate tendency is to look out the window or to say, let's go out into creation. Sort of a synonym for nature. And I said, well, just a second here. If you're not part of creation, then what the heck are you? What are you? See, the last few hundreds of years, we have increasingly in the human community distanced ourselves from the rest of creation, of which we are a part. We have stepped back increasingly so that we're up above it and looking down upon it in our powerful capacity through the tool of science to manipulate it to our own ends. And so we're above and beyond it. We don't need to worry about it. And we've lost our sense of interdependence, our sense of our interconnectedness with, our sense of our interrelatedness with the rest of creation of which we are a part. And this is the third sphere that has been so badly damaged because of the events of Genesis 3. Our first parents, who chose, rather than consume the fruit of the tree of life, to consume the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life offered our first parents and the rest of creation the means by which to mitigate the eternal effects and consequences of the second tree. It's the first tree on which, as we shall see in a moment, the future of reconciliation of all creation literally hangs. The second passage we find at the end of the biblical narrative is ultimately the text for this talk. Now I'm finally getting to it. You were wondering. Then the angel showed me the river of life, the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. I love this passage. I just love this passage. Do you notice what's in it? The tree of life is now bifurcated. Now there's one on each side of the river of life that flows from the throne of God. And there's this image, there's this wonderful picture of life. There's no more curse. We're not struggling anymore. But the intriguing thing is that we still are dependent upon the tree of life. Its leaves are for the healing of the nations. We still must somehow consume what it produces in order for this eternity, this picture of eternity to unfold, and for us to live into life with God and all else in a good way. Its leaves are for the healing of the nations. It produces these crops of fruit that we consume, but its leaves are for the healing of the nations from all peoples. As we read John's Revelation vision, there's a strong hint, at least to me, as an indigenous person, that had our first parents eaten of the tree of life first, a different and more fulsome path would have lain before them and ostensibly us into whatever eternity was and is like. Understanding what is good alone perhaps would have been sufficient to satisfy their curiosity about God, themselves, and the rest of creation of which they were a part. Would have been sufficient for them to say, covenant relationship with all that has been made is adequate for us. Living in right relationship with God, our Creator, and with the other spiritual powers that are present in this creation. Right relationship with one another as human beings, and right relationship with and relatedness to the rest of creation would be adequate for us. We will be content. But the consumption of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil has led us on this human quest for knowledge and experience. At times, very frequently at the expense of others in the human community, and most definitely at the expense of others in the rest of creation. As I mentioned last night, my grandfather taught me many, many years ago that animals are persons too. They're just not people. The writer of Job would tell us in Job 12 that when the human wisdom of his counselors failed, they would do well to look to the rest of creation for wisdom. As he says in 12, ask the animals that walk on the earth, the birds that fly in the air, the fish that swim in the sea. Speak to the earth itself. Which of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? This interdependence, interconnectedness, this valuing of the entirety of creation, we've lost it because we seek for knowledge and experience, power, control, and wealth. And if we're honest, each of us in this room, to greater or lesser extent, struggles most with those things. And again, whether it's position, whether it's respect, whether it's seeking our own dignity at the expense of others, whether it's having more or getting more or achieving more or wanting more, it is our struggle. And it has emerged from this breach of covenant relationship. But it would have been sufficient, I believe, to satisfy that they were that they would have refrained from eating of that second tree, of course, moving all of creation into the eternal, without the blemish of sin and sinfulness. But it's the third mention of this tree that makes it possible for us to complete the journey from the tree of life in Eden to the trees of life in the New Jerusalem that sits at the center of the wider kingdom of our Creator. I loved our conversation this morning. I appreciate Pat and Robin and Emily leading us this morning. It was grand. As we were sitting there, this image came up, and I quickly got out my iPad and wrote some notes about it. The image that when Jesus was crucified, he was crucified in Gethsemane, in a garden. The Garden of Gethsemane, or at least, where he prayed, and then where he was laid to rest. I love the idea that it's a garden. I've got to do some thinking about that. The Apostle Paul observes this in Galatians 3:13. It is written, cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all of the things written in the book of the law. Jesus redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. It's the only time Paul talks this way. It's the only time he uses this. He doesn't say, cursed is everyone who hangs on a cross. He said, cursed everybody who hangs on that tree. And I thought about this, and I thought, and this is my opinion, a theological opinion, but my opinion. I thought to myself, this is that third tree, critically important tree, where if you or I were to be hung on a tree in Roman era justice, law, for some transgression, we would bear in our bodies the penalty for our transgression. We would die, and it's over. It's done. If we were crucified unjustly, we still die, and it's done. But Jesus hangs on this tree, taking upon himself the entirety of the curse. We're approaching that time of year where we sing the hymn, far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found. We're going to sing that. So far as the curse is found, Jesus hung on this tree and took upon himself this curse, the entirety of it. And there he turned what would be death for us into life. And the tree of crucifixion the tree of death became the tree of life for us. There in the center. This is not a linear trajectory, folks. This is taking us from the tree of life in the garden to the trees of life at the end of the narrative via the tree of life that Jesus caused the cross, now to use that, to become. It takes us right back where we started. I love it. We're heading back where we began, just like we did on horseback on that trail. We went back to where we had started so that we might take the better trail. And that's what this idea of doing a circular theological reflection helps us with. It moves us away from this drive towards an unknown and unknowable future to something that invites us to live in the present moment based on the restoration of these three spheres of relationship that are in fact what we're going to have to live with when we get there, wherever there is. And by the way, heaven is not, ladies, the Philadelphia cream cheese advertisement. Albert will not be waiting on you on fluffy white clouds with the Philadelphia cream cheese. Neither is heaven, in my view, us lying prostrate on the ground before the throne of God forever, 365 forever, singing Hillsong. Or Fanny Crosby, for that matter. Moving beyond the events in Eden, Jesus hangs on the tree of the curse, and as we are made aware, becomes cursed for creation's sake. In so doing, he turns the tree of the curse of death into the tree of life. Imagine the imagery. Except a grain of wheat fall in the ground to die, it cannot produce a harvest. It doesn't bring forth anything. Jesus is planted in the ground, and quite literally. And his death causes an abundant harvest. The perfect is seeded into that which has become imperfect by reason of the breach of our first parents and the covenant of God. And as the perfect is seeded into the imperfect, perfection once again has the possibility of emerging. And the fruit of the perfection of God has the potential to become a reality. And we're invited to live into it now. The now but not yet. We're invited to live into it now, not because of a linear trajectory towards an unknown and unknowable future, but because of a known and knowable past that we can return to and set out again, and because of what Jesus has done. There's an order in the description of the two trees in Eden, which, taken together with the fact that following the consumption of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, our first parents are barred, seems to imply that had the order of creation been followed, there would have been different outcomes. Jesus would still have been the one who had lived fully within and among the creation he had authored. I remember years ago being confronted by a young man at an intervarsity event at Urbana on a lecture I was doing, and I was talking somewhat like this, and he said, but Jesus wasn't there at the beginning. He didn't come until. I said, excuse me? Do you ever read Paul? How about John's Gospel? Where'd you get that notion? It seems pretty prevalent in some circles. But Jesus is there at the beginning. So he would have continued to be the requisite for creation to become what God intended, but perhaps in a different way, one not requiring atonement as we've come to describe it today. Instead, it would have been a full fait accompli, an accomplished work of creation's original covenant, unnecessary to expand on, even prior to its having been needful. We would partake of Jesus not as a sacrifice of human blood and body, but as desirable nourishment through which life would have been sustained into eternity. Had our first parents partaken of Jesus, the tree of life, there would have been no necessity of killing to cover or nourish. Jesus would have been spiritual, moral, and visible covering for our ancestors and for us. He would have been sustenance for eternal life simply by our partaking of his essence, much as we do in the Eucharist today. We would proclaim his death until he comes. But now we would proclaim his life, for he is among us. In anticipation of that future experience of God's kingdom fully realized, that's what we would be doing. Since this appears to be true, it becomes clear that the tree of life was accessible to be eaten from in Eden, and that Jesus from the beginning, therefore, was the fruit of the Spirit from which to eat. I now use the word in the sense of taste and see that the Lord is good. This seems an obvious answer because only one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was forbidden. This means that Jesus was freely available to be partaken of at the outset. People who therefore offer that Jesus was God's plan B are very mistaken. always central to God's intent, was the second person of the Trinity. Jesus was and continues to be the plan of our Creator from the beginning, for as the means by which all things, as Paul would note in Colossians, are held together, Jesus is He. Hanging on the tree was a curse, one eagerly embraced by Jesus, for He knew its history. But let me suggest that this was less about penal substitution and was instead about the only means of restoration of our appropriate and only eternal sustenance, the restoration of the shalom of God's creation, the return to where we began, which is, in my view, what heaven will be. Now, I want you to know that contrary to popular understanding and historically taught theology, we are not heading toward a known future, a trail that our first parents were launched on when they chose to break covenant. I don't know where we're going in a linear way, but if I think about it circular, cyclical, I know exactly where we're heading. And I know how to get there through Christ, who's made the way. Were it the case, reconciliation we would be talking about would be constantly future focused with little, if any, room for present-day realities of renewed relationship. If it was all about a deferred consequence to the future and the Lord's return for everything to be done, and I'm not talking realized eschatology, and just hear me out, Jesus would be provision only for an endgame reconciliation with God in that way, with human beings, maybe, depending on your theology, the rest of creation. But with a circular view, it's the constant provision of Christ in anticipation of the eternal full provision of Christ as we partake of those trees, now each side of the river of life. Linear schemes where the future is everything, the past is nothing, and the present is fleeting have not helped us, if we're honest. Have not helped us. The war to end all wars didn't. We brought on a second big one, and then immediately on its heels, a regional one, supposedly by a group of people who were to bring peace and so on, participating. And then another one, and then another one, and then more. And the conflicts that are regional and global are too numerous to mention. Like, it hasn't helped. Linear trajectories have not helped. It's time for a different view, one that is fully situate in the uniqueness of the person, work, life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but does not view the past as irrelevant to the present. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. One minute. Stand with me. Oh, don't go away. You still got them. Stay with me. Stay with you, first of all.
All right.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Terry. And that was wonderful, inspiring. Thank you.